Welcome back to the Cabin of Horrors podcast, where we dive into everything dark, creepy, and of course, terrifying. And in today's episode, I've got something truly exciting. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite horror films of 2024, Terrifier 3. It's just as brutal, bloody, and bizarre as its predecessors. And if you've been a fan of Art the Clown and his reign of terror, you are in for a treat. We're going to be breaking down everything Terrifier 3, its influence on the horror genre, the tropes it embraces, and how it continues to push boundaries. But don't worry, this is going to be a spoiler-free discussion, unlike other seasons of the podcast. We're not going to be doing spoilers or going into plots on any of the future episodes. I'm just going to be giving you guys my thoughts, my feelings, and really all the background regarding the movie, and just discussing and critiquing how great or how bad a film is. So if you haven't seen Terrifier 3 yet, don't worry, you can listen without fear of me ruining any of those shocking moments. Now, whether you're curled up in the dark with your popcorn or you're just listening to get some insight into this cult horror film, sit tight, it's going to be a gruesome ride. Now, to truly appreciate what Terrifier 3 brings to the table, we first need to understand the history of the franchise. The Terrifier films were created by Damien Leone, really carved out a niche for themselves in the horror genre when the first film Terrifier was released in 2016. Now, in case you haven't seen the original Terrifier, we were introduced to the killer Art the Clown. He's a silent, sadistic killer with a penchant for brutal, really often grotesque violence. And Art isn't your typical slasher villain. He's completely unpredictable, and it makes him even more terrifying than the usual masked maniac like Michael or Jason. Art also has an eerie silence to him. It's combined with a playful, almost theatrical nature, which immediately sets him apart from slasher villains like I mentioned, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees. And he doesn't just kill to kill. There's something almost artistic about his violence, whether it's in his creepy gestures or his childlike glee when he's committing heinous acts. Art feels less like a villain and more like an unhinged, sadistic performer. And that makes him even more unsettling than other slasher villains of the past. In 2022, we got Terrifier 2, and at this time, Art the Clown's reign of terror took a step further. The second installment really pushed boundaries with its gory, over-the-top kills and completely set a new standard for what a slasher could be. If you don't remember the pandemonium that happened, people were apparently throwing up in theaters, leaving 5 minutes in. Absolutely wild phenomenon when Terrifier 2 first dropped. And this is really the film that catapulted the Terrifier franchise into cult status that it has today. It generated massive word-of-mouth buzz and a complete reputation for shocking audiences with its audacity. So now we come to Terrifier 3. And Terrifier 2 being known for its extreme gore and super memorable kills, the third chapter ups the ante even more, which I personally didn't think was possible, but they sure achieved it. And it isn't just about bloodshed, it's a critical examination of the evolution of horror itself. Terrifier 3 doesn't simply continue the story of Art the Clown, it builds upon everything the series has done up to this point and adds new elements that really make it feel fresh, unique, and exciting. One of the most striking aspects of Terrifier 3 is how it revitalizes the slasher genre. The slasher subgenre, especially in, I would say, the post-2000s era, had become predictable, often falling back on tired formulas or just doing reboots of classic horror franchises. But with Terrifier 3, we're reminded why we love slasher films in the first place. It embraces the chaos and unpredictability of horror, leaving behind the constraints that many mainstream slashers have fallen into. The unpredictability of the kills, the tension in the air, and the sheer audacity of Art's actions make Terrifier 3 feel completely dangerous and really fresh in a way that's hard to ignore. It's also interesting to note that Terrifier 3 thrives in the indie horror space. While major studios are all the time hesitant to take risks with extreme content, Terrifier 3 reminds us that independent horror is where we often get the most creative and raw films. It doesn't have the constraints of a big studio budget or the pressure to appeal to a wide audience, so Terrifier 3 has the ability to be as extreme and unsettling as it wants. And that freedom gives it a boldness that really sets it apart from the typical sanitized horror experiences that dominates cinema these days. So let's talk about the most obvious feature of Terrifier 3, which is the absolute gore and bloodshed that we get throughout the film. And I mean it when I say gore and bloodshed. Now, if you've seen the previous films in the franchise, you know that Terrifier is not a franchise that shies away from showing you blood, guts, and complete violence. But in Terrifier 3, it's clear that the filmmakers wanted to make an even bolder statement with the amount of violence in the movie. What's fascinating about the gore and practical effects in Terrifier 3 is that it's not just about showing blood for the sake of it. It's being used as a tool that enhances the overall horror experience of the movie. The kills are 100% creative, super imaginative, and absolutely brutal. And they're designed to make you feel the discomfort of the moment. Each death lingers. Each act of violence is drawn out in a way that you feel trapped in the horror with the victims. Now, the gore in Terrifier 3 isn't the kind of violence that you can easily shake off. Definitely not a franchise or a movie for that matter that is for the faint of heart. It doesn't use quick cuts. It doesn't use fast-moving action sequences to hide the brutality. It presents the violence to you in a way that makes it almost too real. The filmmakers intentionally linger on the aftermath, which forces you to confront the visceral consequences of Art's rampage. It's super disturbing, but it's also fascinating because it feels almost like a challenge to the audience on whether or not you can get through a certain scene, let alone the entire movie. And I know a lot of people argue that the gore is excessive. After all, how many times can we see someone's face mutilated before it becomes too much? And it is a valid point. But I think that Terrifier 3 proves that gore can be an essential part of storytelling, especially in the horror genre. The level of violence here is tied directly to the thematic elements of the film. It's about the chaos and madness that Art the Clown represents as a character. The violence is an expression of the world that Art creates. There's no order, no rules, just pure, unfettered chaos. And here's the kicker. While it's disturbing, it's also strangely beautiful. There's a certain artistry to the way that these kills are staged. They're grotesque, but they also feel almost choreographed, with a rhythm and flow that makes them compelling to watch. It's an uncomfortable kind of beauty, but it's there. And that's really part of the genius of Terrifier 3. It uses gore not just to shock the audience, but to create a very specific kind of tension and terror. Now, no discussion about Terrifier 3 would be complete without talking about, of course, Art the Clown. He's not just the villain of this film, and I put villain in quotation marks because I know a lot of fans of the Terrifier franchise root for Art the Clown, while also, of course, rooting for Sienna, who's the final girl of the franchise. But a lot of us, we love Art. He's really the heart and soul of the entire franchise. And he's played by the incredibly talented David Howard Thornton and continues to be a figure unlike any other in modern horror. What makes Art so fascinating is that he isn't just some mindless killer. He's calculated, but there's an element of randomness to his actions. He's not motivated by revenge or by some twisted ideology or being the brother of Sienna. He's simply driven by almost childlike desire to cause pain and suffering. His lack of motivation is really what makes him unpredictable and terrifying. He's just a complete force of nature, and that makes him all the more dangerous. In Terrifier 3, Art's presence is way more intense than any other Terrifier film in the franchise. He's much more playful in his violence, much more sadistic, and more willing to push the boundaries of what's acceptable. But what really makes him stand out is his complete lack of empathy. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't second guess himself at any point. He's just 100% pure evil, and it's completely terrifying. Yet there's something strangely hypnotic about Art the Clown. Despite the horrific things he does, you can't help but be drawn to his chaotic energy. It's really a testament to Thornton's performance that Art never feels like a one-dimensional villain. There's so much more to him than just the kills. Art is really one of the few horror villains who doesn't need words to make an impact. He's 100% silent, just like Michael Myers. He never says a word, which only adds to the eerie atmosphere of the film. Where other villains might monologue or express their motivations, Art simply just acts. He lets his actions speak for themselves. And that silence is really what makes him so much more unsettling than a lot of modern horror villains. It forces you to focus on his movements, his expressions, and his every action, creating an unnerving tension that lingers long after he's off screen. Now let's talk about the genre tropes that Terrifier 3 uses, and in some cases, actually subverts. Slashers, especially classic ones, they're known for a few things: a masked killer, isolated victims, series of gruesome deaths. Terrifier 3, while keeping to those basics, it does something unique. It plays with the audience's expectations. For example, in a lot of slasher films, the villain typically follows a certain pattern. They kill, they're pursued, and eventually they're either caught or in some way eliminated. But Terrifier 3 doesn't follow that formula. Art doesn't wait for a moment of weakness or for his victims to make a mistake. He's relentless and unpredictable, and he doesn't stop until the job is done, and he certainly doesn't play by the rules. In this way, Terrifier 3 breaks free from traditional slasher patterns and opts for something far more chaotic and frightening. Many slasher films also rely on the traditional isolated location. It could be a cabin in the woods, a remote summer camp, or even a haunted house. Terrifier 3, though, keeps the isolated settings but plays with them in interesting ways. The film moves from one location to another, always keeping the audience on edge. And the environments themselves are as terror as Art himself. And that's really a refreshing take on this trope, making things like the Santa Claus scene, the shower scene, all a lot more relevant and disturbing at the same time. So where does Terrifier 3 fit in the larger landscape of horror? The answer's simple. It's a game changer. It proves that the slasher genre still has life in it, and that horror can be as bold and daring as ever. Whether it's the creativity in the kills, unpredictability of Art the Clown, or the way it plays with genre tropes, Terrifier 3 is a film that commands your attention and refuses to let go. If you're a fan of horror that's just raw, real, and willing to go to the darkest extremes, Terrifier 3 is a must-watch. Like I said earlier, it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but for those of us who love our horror with a side of gore and chaos, it's a fantastic addition to the genre. That wraps up today's review of Terrifier 3. I hope you enjoyed our dive into this gruesome, chaotic film, and if you like this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the Cabin of Horrors podcast for more horror reviews, discussions, short stories, and deep dives into horror mythology. Follow us on social media for updates on future episodes, and be sure to leave a review if you loved what you heard. Until next time, stay spooky, stay safe, and remember, horror is always lurking around the corner. Take care.